Thanks, Steve. It's very wonderful to be here with you all today, and thanks for braving the cold to join us on this discussion of symmetry. First, I just want to point out the date, the power of now, the power of this moment, being all together in a room in real life. But let's just look at these numbers for a second. This is February 8th, 2018. Are these numbers symmetrical? Is there symmetry in the date in this moment that we exist in here? Yeah. Well, 2. 2 is a symmetrical number. There's one on each side, for sure. The 8, we can split it into 2 sides of 4s. That's probably symmetrical in its own way. The 18, maybe we can split it into 2 groups of 9, or we can say that it's 2 years just before the 10, the 20, which would make us at a half, and start to cut down and shape away numbers. These are all even numbers, which tells us that if it was the 19th, there would be this one kind of missing hanging piece to the side. So I like to honor the moment that we're all together. This presentation is inspired by this. This, to me, is symmetry. When I think of symmetry, I think of the brain. And I'm just going to talk about psychology for a second, because I'm a geek for psychology. Absolutely a geek. But in the 1800s, there was a gentleman that was doing some work on a railroad named Phineas Gage. And he took a railroad spike and he stuck it in the ground, and there was an explosion in it, and the spike went through his head. And there was no noticeable impact to, there was a hole in his head, but there was no noticeable impact to the way he functioned. And so psychologists started to look at his brain and well, there's a hole in it. There must be something different in the way he thinks, functions, and acts. And they started to find actually there were some minor errors in the way his normal brain would function, such as language, speech. He couldn't control vulgar language, for example. So scientists looked at the brain both sides, and we assumed that the brain at the time was the same on each side. And right in the middle, we have a dividing line, the corpus callosum. And so what scientists did is they started to inhibit they did tests on people, and they inhibited one side of the brain from a sensory perspective from the other. So they might block this eye and ask you to hold an object in this hand, and you could point to the object, but you couldn't pronounce it. And so what that taught psychologists is that there is a difference. Even though we thought 2 sides of the brain are the same, there's a difference. And they're kind of upside down and backwards of each other. And people that are left-handed, for example, are right brain dominant, generally speaking, so they're more creative, they're more abstract, they're more colorful. I'm left-handed. This presentation, the first half is going to be largely abstract, different. Then I'm going to flip it upside down and backwards, and I'm going to do a little bit more process-oriented. I'm going to think about linear relationships and numbers, and all of it is going to be tied around symmetry. This is a beautiful Mercedes-Benz ad that I just thought spoke to me so deeply. This presentation is also inspired by the movie Memento, my favorite director, Christopher Nolan. But I love this picture and this image. It's a picture and a picture and a picture and a picture. And so I'm obsessed. I have to say I'm honestly obsessed with the idea of things compounding upon themselves. And I think that there is true symmetry in that. Hopefully we'll find out. This movie actually, if you're familiar with it, was cut and edited. Again, the story is told upside down and backwards. Kind of interesting. But it is my favorite, absolutely. So let's actually get into the meat of what we're talking about. And our friend in the back mentioned jazz. Let's just riff. Let's have some fun. Let's explore some creative space and that side of the brain, the right side of the brain, and just riff on the concept of symmetry. So when we think of symmetry, naturally, there's reflection. There's an opposing side. There's a one and then the other, and a balance between the two. If we think about cliches around symmetry, symmetry is beauty might be something that you've heard. If that's totally true, then why do people say if you're taking a picture of me, only capture my good side of my face? That's because life technically doesn't fit into a symmetrical mold, but I think we're all seeking out the perfection that comes from the idea of symmetry. And on the other side of reflection, I think you have creativity. You have curiosity, the unknown. And when we think about reflection, then we conjure certain stereotypes or images of our mind, maybe a mirror image, or a reflection. And then we start to think a little bit more about opposing forces. So I'm going to just, I talk a lot, so I'm going to just stop for a second and scrape everything away and say, on the one side of opposing force, we can start with nothing. We can start with a blank page. And if you're like me and maybe sometimes a procrastinator, this is scary. But maybe for others, this idea of a white space or a blank page is empowering. It's open. On the other side of that, you have something. You have darkness. So the absence of color becomes color. And this could represent a thing. It could represent everything. But it's the other end of that spectrum. But that doesn't give us much to work with to truly understand what we're talking about here. And if we come completely from the one side of darkness in the edge, and we start to sliver out a crack of light in here, and we put it in the middle, maybe we'll find some symmetry and some balance. This is symmetrical, even though we've added a line to the middle. On the other side of it, so going from something and opening up a little crack of light, then there's opportunity for light to come in. On the other side, we have whiteness, and then we have an opportunity for something to be put on the page or something to exist then in front of us. And again, in this case, it's a dividing line in between. What is that dividing line? If you did research on symmetry, you'd find that symmetry exists in nature, in architecture. It pervades all design, every experience that we have. But they talk about it being about balance and about harmony. If you've ever heard of the concept of mindfulness, it's being able to reconcile the fact that we're constantly reflecting on the past, thinking about the moment that we operate in, that dividing line, and the future going forward. Dividing line is actually a balance scale that balances out those opposing forces. And so I could just list values and words and themes that are opposites of each other. So on the one side, we have light, we have dark. We have right, we have left. We have long, we have short, we have rich, we have poor. And these things all help us to classify. These are labels. They allow us to put unknown into a box, into a thing, and then classify it. Yes, no, forward, backward. These are binary. And then again, being opposing forces, at all times we're kind of challenged to either subconsciously or consciously consider those opposing forces no matter what decision that we make. So life is not set up by a rigid system of absolutes, but actually all of the perspectives and all of the spectrum that exists in between these opposing forces. And tension and elasticity is where actually creation comes from. It doesn't come from security. It doesn't come from being safe. It comes from discomfort, from the unknown, mixed with the known. So again, applying that concept of the balance scales, that's where we see that sits in the middle, dividing to both the left and the right side, applying symmetry to what we're seeing in front of us. So let's just think about those balance scales just for a second. And I'm talking a lot, and I'm using a lot of abstract, high-level concepts. So let's just zoom out. Let's make things simpler. And let's just consider a dot. Is this still symmetry? Is this what we see in front of us symmetrical? Absolutely. We can divide it any number of ways, and it'll still be on the one side a reflection of the other. Let's take it away one more time. But we need it. We've come a long way, so let's add it back in. We have a thing, a 1. We add another one, and we have 2. And we still have symmetry here. No matter where we divide the lines, we can probably find a way where 1 plus 1 gives us that balance that we're seeking when we seek out symmetry in nature. But what if we add a third, that odd, that solo? We still have symmetry if we split the line down the middle. And so now we have a 1.5, and that's how that division happens. But what you also see happening is that shapes are forming in front of us. Let's add one more dot, and let's make a square. Your eyes can connect the dots and see that kind of start to happen. We can divide it, still symmetrical. We can even divide it the other way. Now, when we do this, now we get multiple squares that form out of the whole. That is still symmetry. Scale is still symmetry. Multiplication is still symmetry. And we can also take that dividing line and make it less structured, and we can move it diagonally. And now we have a different perspective upon the thing that we were just looking at. And I might argue that this line that we're seeing again and again is our perspective. That dot is us. That line is us. That's how we look out at the world and treat the opposing forces. And now we're starting to think about shapes. And we can mix and match and put them together, and we see shapes forming in nature. Flowers, stars, in this case mushrooms. But the hardest one to get is the star in that little matching game. But look what happens when we have a star. a very common object to us all. I'm sure we've all seen many different types of these before. It's symmetrical depending on where we put certain dividing lines. But what's also neat about this is it's 5, so we have that fifth. We have an odd carrier hanging out. And also, there's something else represented here that's deeply human, which might be the human body. What else comes in numbers of 5s? Well, that would be our senses. That's how we relate and connect to the world. That's how we exist within the world, is through our senses. None of this information is new. I mean, we've been studying, we've been looking at the nature of self, the nature of identity, and how we operate in the world for hundreds and thousands of years. And we study this. And we look for the patterns, and then invariably we try to break them. So is symmetry beauty? Then why do we try to break it? When we look in nature, we see symmetry occurring over and over again. Here it exists in a flower. But we're also getting into we're pushing that concept now, we're moving a little bit beyond linear. And we're getting into spirals. And so this idea, this concept actually occurs at the micro and the macro level no matter where you look all around us. This is a mathematical formula called the golden ratio. And this mathematics, so now I'm moving a little bit more from the creative, and I'm using the other side of my brain to say that on the mathematical side and all the different equations, all of these symbols basically tell the same story that I've been telling you in a different way. This is a little bit more concise and easy to understand, but shapes and patterns emerge and they form ultimately a golden ratio which becomes spiral. And if we zoom out to the largest possible amount, we see, well, is that the largest possible amount? I don't know what's beyond the universe, but anyways, we see even at a massive macro scale, the spiral, the golden ratio that emerges from the concept of symmetry repeating over and over and over again. So now I've gone small, I've gone large. I'm just going to scrape it away again. I'm going to come back to that dot. And that's us. And that's us right now, right in this moment. And what if I extend out that dot in 2 separate directions? And I said earlier that could be left or right. But what if that's time? What if that's the next dimension? And maybe, as I mentioned earlier, at any given point, we're consciously or subconsciously aware of what is behind us. We live in the now. Can we do that effectively? And can we plan for the future? That's the whole concept of mindfulness. Can we be 10% happier by just not worrying so much about what's behind us and what's in front? But if we think about time and we apply the concept of the spiral, then we have this type of pattern layered over top. And this is a sinusoidal curve that again exists in nature. It's derived out of the spiral. This is actually also the heartbeat of a human being. But this also reminds me of doing anything, starting with that blank slate and taking a step, walking forward. So if I know that I have to take a step, it's not actually just a matter of taking a step. There's a lot that goes into taking that first step for anything. So what I like to think about when I see this, I see the peaks and valleys of entrepreneurship, but I see motion, I see human, I see and time as a function being applied to that with symmetry at its core. And like the slinky, everybody loves we can stretch it out and we can compress it back together. And so time is actually a construct based on our perspective of how long we stretch out that curve and how much we compact it back down together. And maybe it is a dot, or maybe it is a thing. And this concept also reminds me of something else deeply seated in nature, which is DNA, the 2 strands of a DNA. And why am I so obsessed with this? And why do I see this? Why do I see these patterns in everything and everywhere? Now I'm going to just flip it upside down and backwards, and I'm going to do a little bit more of a linear storytelling approach and leave behind the right side of my brain, the abstract and creative, and just flip the switch. I believe that to talk about symmetry, that's the role I was born to play. I literally believe that with every fiber of my being. I believe that my purpose is to stand in front of you here today and share that. And here's why. This is my office. This is my workspace. I happen to share this workspace with my best friend in the whole entire world. I'm an identical mirror twin, which means that you can have twins, and 2 separate eggs makes a fraternal twin. 1 single egg splits, and it makes identical twins. And so there's lots of us out there where you see one and you mistake for the other. But what will happen, there's a cycle. Just like everything else, there's a cycle when the egg is going to split. And if the egg splits at the last possible point, it makes conjoined twins. So that's how that occurs in nature. Just before that, it makes an upside down, backwards mirror image of itself. And so that is what I am, and that's what my identical twin brother, Chris, is. I'm left-handed, he is right-handed. I'm missing this tooth from my skeleton, he's missing this tooth from his skeleton. Did we have hair? It would part on opposite sides of ourselves. So, seeing this in front of us, I get mistaken to Chris all the time. If I asked a rhetorical question to you and I said, what is the most pleasing sound that you could ever hear? You're probably, I might coach you to this answer, but it's your own name. So my name is Tyler, I love that sound, but I have been trained and conditioned my whole entire life that when somebody says Chris, I look and I respond. I get to meet people that way. I get mistaken for being on TV sometimes because he's on TV, and it's great. I just absolutely love it. He is my best friend, as I mentioned, and we look the same, we sound the same, and family members still confuse us, and I don't blame them. But what fascinates me and what I spent far too much time thinking about is why are we so different? So, Chris and I share all the same interests. I know that if I'm going to like comic books or video games or whatever, he's going to be my partner in crime along the way. But I am very extroverted, loud, abstract, random. He's very process-oriented. He's linear. My major was marketing in university. As a creative professional, I thought that just lights me up. And for Chris, it was political science, because policy really lit him up. So we are completely different, and I try to understand why is that, and it's nature, and it's nurture. And if we start at the core, at that DNA, I say, well, we are the same, and nurture has influenced us a little bit, but we're so very different, and I believe it's because handedness affects brain dominance. So this is what I spend my time thinking about. Quick poll of the audience. Which one's which? Chris on the left? We got an agreement? Excellent. You guys get the award. I've done this similar type of question before, and I was in a room talking to people, and I got 0 for 0. So congratulations. You're ahead of my grandma, in fact. Shameless self-promotion. Who doesn't love that? I'm not sure which one is which. And so I come back here, and I say, this has to be why we're so different. And I truly believe that. And if Chris was here, standing in front of us, he would disagree with me. He would say, we're not that different, Tyler. In fact, you're just thinking too much off on your own. You should probably come back in and join the crowd of people and be a part of the community. Because collaboration is greater than the sum of the parts. We are better when there's more of us together. But what Chris would say, and there we are working together, just so you know, I am blessed. I am blessed to learn from him and talk constantly all the time. But what he would say, and I should back up and just tell a little bit of our personal history. I have always done things differently, and I've chosen to do so. And I wonder if it's because I'm always compared to somebody else, because it's natural to have that competition, to say, well, you both should be as athletic or as smart in this way. So when it came time to go to university, I dropped out. And Chris stayed the course and got his degree. And I went back to school later. And Chris did the traditional path of getting married and having many kids. And technically, those kids are actually half me, genetically speaking. So my work is done. But the scariest part about that is that I actually get a mirror where I see Chris aging faster than I am. And I think it's because he has all those kids and responsibilities. So I have a strand of gray. His is coming in much thicker on the opposite side. But we balance each other out. But we've done these very different, him more traditional, mine just saying I like to be the black sheep. What Chris says is actually that our lives go like this. So where I am passionate about psychology and personality, and I've applied that to marketing and branding, Chris has applied his passion for policy to employment and personality and staffing. So we're both achieving the same goal of addressing personality, but we're doing it from our different approaches. And right now, we both happen to be working together, and we both happen to be like this. So I think Chris is right. But I also think I'm right, and since I'm here, I get to have the last word. And lastly, well, I have 2 more things. what Chris and I talk about these days, when we hang out all the time, and I will be on a bench with him as old men, you know, pointing at each other and saying who was right. And he's older, by the way, so he always says it's him by 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, he learned everything he had to know. Very symmetrical number, 11. What Chris and I talk about is the world that we live in and how to make sense of it all. But we feel like the moment that we're in all collectively as a civilization and as a society, we're on a pendulum. And I'm sure that's not a new statement or concept, but we truly feel it and we believe it. And whether or not Chris and my pendulum is going like this, I think collectively as a world, we've all gone like this. We've all become very fearful. We've all become very isolationist. We've looked at the globalized world and we've said, well, nah, yes and no. So we've almost stretched as far over as we can that way. And now we're going to start coming back to the other way. But rest assured that it keeps going like this. It's symmetrical. It's a swing. Time is a construct. So my big idea was to have Chris come in here in a mystery reveal and say, well, this is actually, I'm an identical mirror twin, and here he is, and he's gonna give the presentation for the last half, and I was gonna be off the hook, but he couldn't make it here today. So I did ask him for 3 rapid-fire points that he would want people to know. I didn't give him any coaching, and this is what he said. This is Chris, and I'll use my Chris voice and my Chris face. Your brain lies to you, but it's okay, everyone's does. Values-based relationships are always better than transactional ones. And symmetry is beautiful. So I gave Chris the last word. But thank you all very much for your time.